I'm Dr. Manju Appathurai, and this is The Scented Edge. My passion for these conversations comes from my own journey. This podcast is an effort to translate that lived experience into something meaningful and positive. Now, let's get into the episode. So let's begin. I'm Dr. Manju Appathurai, and this is The Scented Edge. And today we have with us Karl Godderis, author of Live and Let Live, and many other amazing spy novels, which I will let you tell us, but this is the book. And it spans the world. It spans US, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Portugal, Japan. Wow. Okay, so what first pulled you to write a spy novel?
Well, good morning and thank you for having me, Manju. And straight to the topic, right? I've always been writing throughout my life short stories, but more for myself, dabbling left and right, and hoping that maybe one day I would come to write a book. I've lived a long time in Indonesia, and this is where the key inspiration for this book comes from, primarily because towards the latter part of my years in Indonesia, I was actually a whistleblower to a very large corporate fraud case in the country. And at the time, my neighbor was a book publisher, and he knew about this. And he said, if ever you're gonna write a book about this whistleblowing story, I will publish it. And so we signed off some kind of arrangements around that. Now, years went by. I went to live in Australia after that for good 4 years. And it was when I found myself here in Malaysia during the pandemic, particularly in the first lockdown we had here, MCO1, right? That suddenly I found myself professionally with a lot of spare time. And I thought, well, maybe this is the moment in life where I do something that I might enjoy very much, which is writing a book. Why not write a book about that past event, which I had well documented. I had kept my own notes. I had started to write some stuff about it. And so I gathered that part of my prior writing as well as other short stories I had developed over the years, and then actually concluded that if I were to write a book just about this whistleblowing saga, it would be a very boring read, because most people who are in the know already know all the details, so they were probably not going to buy a book and read about it. And maybe to the wider public it doesn't make much sense because there's probably already so many whistleblower based stories out there. So I then decided, why don't I, since I know Indonesia very well, why don't I just develop a fiction story that is more espionage related, because that's a genre that I read a lot myself, and maybe use the material from the actual whistleblowing case as part of a character description and as an introduction to the broader story that then develops in that book. So I wrote this book frantically. It took me 7 weeks. I wrote every day. I woke up at 5, I was at my desk at 6, writing typically till lunchtime, doing my research on the go. And I had in the meantime also found an editor while I was writing, and had to deliver certain material by certain dates and so forth. And it was actually progressing quite well, but then suddenly the announcement came that MCO1, the lockdown, would come to a closure, and my book wasn't finished yet. So ironically, I was praying for the MCO to continue. But more or less, the time the first MCO finished, I finished my main manuscript, and then it went into final editing, layout review, and then my publisher, who I had that deal with from years prior, stuck to his commitment. By then he had actually moved to the US. And so he completed the publication, made sure it went on Amazon, both in hard copy and in Kindle version. And then here in Malaysia, I did a local book launch, if you like, at various locations. I managed to convince 2 book clubs to put it on as the book of the month, one which was actually organized by the Belgian embassy. So we then had the book review at the residence of the ambassador, and then 10 Belgian people came together. And so for those groups, of course, it was a fantastic experience to do a book review with the author in the discussion, because then they got so much more background to certain aspects of the storyline or the characters and so on. So yeah, this is how it all happened. And then came a few months later MCO2, and then everyone was asking me, so are you going to write the next book? I said, well, I'm not really ready for that. But then came MCO3, and then I thought, I have something in mind. By then I had received some, let's say, supportive research material for the second book. Reading that, I thought, I think I have a story. So then I started writing. MCO3 lasted, I think, 3 months, and it was a bit lighter, but still there were certain restrictions, and I used that time. So the second one, instead of in 7 weeks, I wrote it in 3 months, and then also it required a fair bit more research, because it covers a lot more geographic locations, some of which I had never visited, so I had to find my way into describing locations where I put my characters without having been there myself. And then that second book came out, and again, same thing, book launch here in Malaysia, social media campaign. I also used the experience of writing these books to test my digital marketing skills. So for the first book, for example, I made videos while I was writing it to kind of prepare an audience for a book to come, and I posted that on LinkedIn and on Facebook. So there was a kind of overall quite a comprehensive combined project for me, which I very much enjoyed. Yeah.
Okay, very, very exciting life, Karl. And if I go here, Cyril, the main character in the movie, in the book, soon, hopefully soon to be made a movie, an ex-management consultant who is now an investigative journalist, is approached by US law enforcement team, and the story goes on to assist with a clandestine mission across the globe. So coming back to your story about whistleblowing, you seem to have lived a very, very colorful life, going across continents and doing multiple different things. So tell me a little bit about this vast life living experience that you have had, which maybe inspired the book, because it sounds fascinating. You are as fascinating as Cyril.
Yeah. Well, indeed, I've lived now 30 years in this part of the world. I lived the longest in Indonesia, that was almost 20 years. However, I started in Malaysia first with an internship, which after a few months then brought me to Jakarta. And then in Indonesia, I lived in Bandung and Semarang as well. Then after Indonesia, I lived about a good 4 years in Australia, and then 6 years ago, I came to Malaysia. But through that time, I did a lot of project work across the region, whether I was in Mumbai, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo, Bangkok. Not living there, but going there regularly for project work. So I was heavily exposed to this region. Yeah, working in consulting for the longest, often in multi-skilled, multicultural teams. And part of that experience also fed into the books, in a sense that why is an ex-consultant being asked by law enforcement to contribute? Because I thought there's also an ex-journalist in the team, an ex-activist, because my personal opinion, but also in the book, the law enforcement agency in question, which is a real one, but I let the reader find out who it is, they felt that they could complement their effectiveness by having people from different disciplines join their investigation. And this is reflective of my own experience, working particularly, as I said, in consulting, where I had colleagues who had studied medieval German, French literature, geography, biology, and all ending up in corporate finance, for example. So, and I always felt that there's a lot of power in that mixed blend of backgrounds and skills, and backgrounds also including cultural or national backgrounds. Yeah, so that has been an important theme for me, right? To live that. Now, as to how do I then experience living in the region, and how does that shape me as a person, and as partially was reflected in the book. Look, I come from Belgium originally, and maybe up here not many people realize that, but we are a small country in Europe that probably has been colonized for the best part of 2,000 years, all the way back from Julius Caesar to the Nazis during the Second World War, and then every European country you can think of in the middle, whether it's the Vikings, the Spanish, the Austrians, the Dutch, the French, and so on, the English. So we are, as a nation, kind of discreet, low-profile people, because we always had to bend along where the power was coming from, while keeping our cultural and economic identity intact. So we produced a lot of culture, a lot of economic initiatives over centuries came out of that part of Europe, and primarily that worked because we were bending along the powers that be. On top of that, Belgium is a multicultural nation. We have 2 official languages, so that also shapes a bit the mentality of the country. So then when I came to, let's start with Indonesia first, where I so often got confronted with comments about kind of neo-anti-colonialism, I always felt like we've been colonized much longer than Indonesia has. So we in Europe or in Belgium, we're not complaining about this or that doesn't work because that or that nation colonized us for so long. So there's an element of step up and take matters in your own hands. At the same time, particularly in Indonesia, I understood their character of also bending a bit along the winds, just as we had to do. So that's where I gel quite well with that environment. In Malaysia, I find partially the same thing. The only difference is Malaysia, I would say, is an ex-colony with a strong migration component on top of it, which you don't have in Indonesia, which you don't have in Belgium. And then the years I lived in Australia, there was originally a small colony, which is now basically composed of primarily only migrants. I think 1 in 3 Australians are not born there. 2 in 3 have parents that are born in Australia, so that's a very migrant-focused culture and mentality. So I had to navigate through all of that. Plus, my personal passion and discipline is history. I studied economics and I had another master in international relations. I did minors in history. I still read a lot of history, either on the fiction or the non-fiction side. So I'm a kind of a studied observer of national character and cultures and mentality. And because of where I come from myself, where we're also a little bit like that, kind of helped me to find my way in this part of the world.
So, Karl, the question people wanted to ask Ian Fleming, I'm going to ask you. Are you Cyril? Are you the spy? How much of you is in this story, truly?
Well, there's certain things I'm not allowed to say. I'm joking. I'm definitely not a spy. Yeah, there's a difference between
Would you tell me if you were?
And if I were, I wouldn't tell you. But yeah, being interested in a certain genre topic doesn't mean that is your genre. You might be fascinated by murderers in Stephen King stories. That doesn't make you a killer yourself. Cyril, there are aspects of that reflect on me. I mean, if only the professional background of the character in the books, the dialogues that I make him part of in both books are partially reflective, not all of them, because there has to, of course, support a storyline, but some of these dialogues are reflective of conversations I've had myself through the years, where in some cases it's almost verbatim reflection of what I said, and in other cases a self-correction where it's like, I wish I said that, and now in the book I took my chance to say it the way I wanted it to be said. So in that sense, yes, there are aspects of me, and obviously the Cyril character is from Belgium in the books. But I've met quite a few, particularly in recent times, very successful Belgian writers, for example, when they came to Malaysia for the Penang Literature Festival, and then we do events with them here in KL, which I'm quite involved in. And every person you talk with as a writer will tell you the same thing. Every writer puts himself in the story, right? It's extremely difficult to completely ignore yourself as a writer when writing a book and disconnecting yourself entirely from the story and the dialogues and the characters. So in that sense, I think I answered your question.
I write non-fiction, I write self-help books, and that process and the mindset of that is quite different because you're addressing a specific issue. Now, when you are writing fiction, and you even said you're writing about places you've never been to, how do you get into that mindset? What is that process like to be Karl in daily life, to step into Karl the author?
Yeah, and I had this conversation also with writers like yourself who are more in non-fiction. The difference with non-fiction is there's less pressure on momentum, on keeping momentum, because you just write a next chapter when you're ready based on research and so on, or idea development to go for it. From my experience with non-fiction, it's a highly emotional experience, and you want to go back every day to the dialogues. You want to go back to your characters because you get so attached to them. I can give you an example which is a bit extreme, which relates to the first book. I had decided that for the benefit of the storyline, one character, a woman, had to die. But I so much enjoyed putting her in the story, writing dialogues that involved her, that I was dreading a little bit that moment. And then one morning I woke up and I said, okay, today I'm going to write the scene where she dies. So I wrote that scene, and when I finalized the final sentence, I was crying for half an hour, trying to convince myself to reverse my decision and put her back in the story, maybe a few chapters down the road, where actually she wasn't that, and so on. But I decided to stick to my initial plan. But this is how emotional it can get. So, and this is also why I'm taking my time to write the third book, because I know once I start, I really have to finish. Otherwise, if I make it a 2-year project, the emotional attachment will fizzle out, and I think it won't do justice to the quality that I aspire, at least, for the book. And you talk to some fiction writers, once they start, they have to keep going. So if needed, they spend a lot of time on research to make sure they have too much material, because once you start writing, and particularly working with characters, you have to keep going. Otherwise you miss because they're fictitious characters, but somehow you imagine real people, imagine real conversation, and it feels like every day you want to go back to that, right? I have to finish this part today because I really have to go back tomorrow or later to the dialogue that I had in mind between those two people, and I'm really excited to work on that dialogue. So you just keep working on it. So that's why I think there's a big difference between writing fiction versus non-fiction.
So help us to understand a bit what the process is like for you, because you said you wrote for 7 weeks, the first one, 3 months, the second one, and you start at 6 a.m. So what is the entire process is like from the time you get the idea to the time you get it out?
Well, I only have 2 data points, right? So but for those 2 books, the first one I had a few characters in mind, well, a topic, an overall topic, yeah? So the topic of the book, it's on the cover, so I'm not giving it away. It's about a business complot that takes place in Indonesia, and that involves the Trump family, the royal Saudi family, and an Indonesian conglomerate. Some of that is invented, some of it is not, but bent to a certain degree to make it a bit more romanticized, is the term, right? So I had that in mind. Then I also had in mind a ending for the book. I had in mind the whole notion of that law enforcement agency using non-spies or people from outside the sector to improve the multi-skill component of the character. And then I had a few events and topics in mind that I say, okay, if I develop these topics, that will lead towards the closure of the book that I have in mind. Now, very important also, that's where the first book is very different of the second. I wanted to write a book also in the style of magical realism, which is a genre whereby you confuse the reader as to which characters are fact, which one are fiction, which ones are in a dream, right? And so there's a big part of the book that is written in that style. So that made it extra complicated because you have to somehow, not everything can be just explained under the banner of magic. There has to be an element of credibility to that as well, right? As in you can describe someone imagining characters, but then you relate it to, for example, a mental health issue, right? And then I did research on how does that work and what that happened, right? So, but then anyway, I started writing, and to a degree the book develops itself. I'm an intuitive writer, so I just start had an opening scene in mind. I did a bit of research on opening scenes, and then I started writing. Now, as I said, I was writing from typically 6 till 12, and then the rest of the day where I had time, I did research. A lot of that research was more following masterclass, because I'm subscribed to masterclass classes with famous writers. Salman Rushdie, Dan Brown, David Baldacci. So kind of get a sense of what process do they go through when they write books. Then, as I was on masterclass, I noticed there was a new class being posted there by an ex-senior hostage negotiator of the FBI, who then later on started a consulting business.
Black Swan, it's called.
The company, I believe so.
Yeah.
And so he helps companies with negotiation tactics. So I followed all these classes, and that gave me then the material, technical material, to write certain dialogues where interrogations take place in the book. So all of that happened in parallel. Indonesia I knew well enough, I didn't have to do too much research on that. Portugal, I picked places that I had traveled. Saudi Arabia was completely new. So there I had to really go on Google Maps, go down to the street level, look how the embassy of a certain country the building looks like, so I described it correctly. You look at distances traveled in the story. If you say, yeah, they go from the airport to that place and 10 minutes later they show up, you then look on Google Maps. Well, if in reality it's take 3 hours, that's not going to hold because someone is going to pick up on it, right? So these level of detail I covered. And then you start writing, and every now and then you hit a fork where you say, okay, here I can go left, I can go right. I thought I was going to go right, but I just made a character in a dialogue say something that just came out of pure intuition. I make a person say something which was not planned in advance, but just by making that person say something, then I'm thinking, why do I go right here? I might rather go left because that connects with that dialogue, and actually that might open up a set of possibilities. It will still bring me back to my main storyline, but it will add some color. I bring them to a new location. I introduce them to a new character. And so this is a bit the process I follow, but it's very intense, right? It goes day by day. So what I also do, every morning, I don't start writing immediately. The first thing I did at 6 a.m. was to reread what I wrote the day before. Not so much with the intention of correcting, but more to bring my emotions back to speed, to where they were while I was writing the day before that particular section. And then, okay, I'm right there again, and now I'll start writing what is next. So that was my daily discipline as well.
It does seem to me there are like 1,000 things to manage in writing a fiction book, because dialogues to consider, like you say, geography, distance, just so many things to consider. So do you think creativity was something you were born with, or did you develop it? Is there hope for people looking to write fiction books?
Yeah, but I would say what helped me is not just creativity, I'll come back to that, but also my experience with project management, because as a consultant, that's all I had to do for so many years. And for me, this was one giant project. Because mind you, in parallel, I was also shooting these videos, right? Not hundreds of them, but that was part of the initiative. So that gave me a certain discipline and a focus on how to keep moving forward. Okay, here I have to pause for research, here I have to pause for this and that. So that plays a part. But the creative part, I think some of it you're born with, some of it you can learn, but you need to want to learn it. I think this is very important. And wanting to learn, not everyone is born a pianist. You can learn to play piano, but if you don't have the grit to accept that it will take you 3 years to get to a certain level, and that's why so many children drop out, for example, in music school, because they're too young to really have that level of grit, right? So, but some do, be it partially pushed by parents, or grandparents, or whatever. So I think there's a combination of inherent talents, inclination towards, and then a focus on developing the skill. As I said, I wrote short stories my whole life. In my profession, I had a lot of writing assignments, which I always liked doing. focused on quite in a very dedicated way, reviewing and so forth. So that all helps, right? So for me, it was not a burden to write every day 1,000 words. That was actually a passion. So that helped. And that nurtures the creativity, I believe. Yeah.
This podcast is supported by Work. More than just a co-working space, it's an ecosystem built for human connection. So whether you're established or you're a startup, find room to grow at Work. So writing this book and the second book, what do you think the book itself has taught you?
It has not so much, well, it taught me the process of writing, right? Where I had to learn rather the hard way that the writing part, which was what I did it for, is only a small part of making sure that this book is here in front of you, right? So I had to learn the whole post-production process of editorial review, layout, the publishers saying, are you 100% sure that this is your final version? Because an extra page defines the width of the back of the book, the spine, and that has impact on the printing. And so all these little things I wasn't aware of were kind of connected. Then the type of paper you pick also defines the spine. The spine is always the biggest problem for publishers because the spine is driven by number of pages and the type of paper you pick. And we had to decide, I didn't know that early on, that you take 70-gram eggshell, and then the editor and publisher rather says, if that's the type of paper we go for, okay, let's now work on that basis, complete your manuscript, don't change a word, because if you change 2 words, a page might drop out, or I might add a page, and that will then define again the spine. So these are things that I learned, that I thought, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So in that sense, that's what it taught me. I mean, that whole practical sides to publishing, right? You can say, well, if you only publish digital books, then you don't have that problem, but okay, I did both. Then the other one was more about but that was more a confirmation. In my career, particularly as a consultant, a very important component was always to interview people, to run dialogues that bring information to the surface, because that information is then sometimes things we need to deliver a consulting project. And I felt that I focused a lot on that in my writing. I was really testing my skills in empathy. And at a given moment, in the first book, there is a rape scene. And I had a long discussion with my editor about the perspective I use in the storyline. So is it in the first person, is it the third person, is it an omniscient person above? And because she said, once you pick a perspective, you got to stick to it. And I said, well, that's convention, I don't have to follow that convention. So I played around with perspectives. And at a given moment, because I changed a bit chapters, the rape scene, which was originally written in the third person, I decided to write it in the first person. And I was really scared when I started, because I said, here I am, a man, describing a woman being raped quite brutally in the first person. That is not going to have any credibility at all. Then came my first book club, all women. And I asked them, I said, did you read that rape scene? Yeah, what did you think of it? Was it credible? They say, yeah, wow, it was really realistic. I said, do you realize only that is this only scene in the entire book written in the first person? And I'm the man writing it. Therefore, I'm asking, was this credible? And they say, yes. So that was a massive testing of my feeling of empathy. And I felt like, okay, I learned from that, because now I tested myself so far, also in the dialogues where you have a man and a woman talking to each other, be it both in the dialogue is in first person, but they're also constantly switching. The male perspective easier for me than the female perspective. You have to make sure that the female voice in the dialogue sounds like a woman, right? a realistic woman, right? Not a boilerplate woman. And so that helped me a lot. And also afterwards, I think in my work, that continued then to be more consulting-oriented interim CEO jobs, where listening skills and managing dialogue for a win-win purpose it became very important. So, and I think part of that I enhanced by the experience of writing these books. Yeah.
You mentioned being CEO. Aside from writing amazing novels, the other thing also keeps you occupied is a very small matter as the CEO of the European Chambers in Malaysia. And that's a big role to take on. So how do you manage your time, Karl?
Well, that was a full-time role, and for all transparency, it was an interim CEO job. I have done turnaround gigs over the years as part of consulting or as pure as an appointed CEO to turn around an organization. And so the same was with EUROCHAM, where I was on a good year mandate to turn around the organization, and that was a full-time role. So there was no such thing as writing books in the past 12 months. So in those moments, then of course I just focus on the job. And that's why I said I'm kind of conflicted internally about writing the third book, because I know once I start I have to push everything else aside, and in recent times I didn't have the opportunity to do so. Yeah.
How long have you been the CEO of EUROCHAM, and could you tell me a little bit about what EUROCHAM does and how it helps European Malaysian trade in the country?
Yeah, so my role is January to January, so it's a good 12-month period, so it covers primarily 2025. EUROCHAM is the prime advocacy platform for European companies in Malaysia. So we channel industry on an industry by industry basis or on a topic by topic basis the aspirations European companies have in terms of regulatory change or influence on regulatory development in dialogue with the Malaysian government agencies. So that's our prime role. On top of that, but specific for this year, is that just as I started my role, the EU and Malaysia announced that they were going to resume free trade negotiations, which are now in process, and EUROCHAM was called upon to participate and support that process, particularly supporting, of course, the European Embassy delegation here and the EU FTA negotiation team in channeling the expectations of European companies for that to-be-signed trade agreement, but all while remaining in dialogue with our Malaysian counterparts. For example, MIDA, FMM, we are in conversation with them, because from a European Union point of view, free trade agreements have to be a win-win model, not a bullying style trade agreement model. Therefore, they take a bit longer, because you have to find compromise on every single item that is in dispute. Not everything is in dispute, but there are always certain hurdles that need to be overcome, and we don't bully each other into accepting them. So yeah, that's a bit the process, and that's why I have that engagement, not just with European Union, but also with the Malaysian side of things. And so this is now in process. So the second round of the negotiations took place in KL in November, third week of November. And they've agreed there that they're going to accelerate, and they already agreed on 4 more rounds. The next one taking place already in February in Brussels, and then they alternate every 3 months, either in Brussels or in KL. So that's now the process that they agreed upon. Yeah.
Given your vast experience in managing new trade in Malaysia, can you tell us what are the challenges that EU companies face in Malaysia and what are the opportunities?
Yeah, the challenges, I mean, first of all, there are more opportunities than challenges, and that also reflects in the numbers, right? So European companies have been present in Malaysia probably for close to 100 years. The vast majority, when we survey them, have been here for longer than 10 years. So people come here, they invest here, they stay in Malaysia. You don't do that if there is an opportunity to stay, right? So this is the core message, that we are here because there's a large opportunity to do so. And it will remain like that because Malaysia is uniquely positioned in the region, particularly in a few sectors which are important also for Europe, which is in machinery, electronics, semicon, there's chemicals. Just to mention a few, Malaysia has a strong focus on shared service centers, so there's many large European companies who have their Asian shared service center here also in Malaysia, so that will remain the attraction for coming here. Malaysia is a very export-oriented country, and 70% of the GDP comes from export. Obviously, a majority of these European companies are in Malaysia, not so much for the local market, but using Malaysia as an export hub. And the more Malaysia is part of open trade agreements with other parts of the world, the more that export hub function will develop and remain attractive. In terms of hurdles, well, look, right now, a key component that Malaysia is aware of, and that is also reflecting on how European companies operate here, is that you're very dependent on foreign labor. You have more than 3 million foreign workers in Malaysia. Relative population, it's a ratio you don't find anywhere else in Southeast Asia. There's nothing wrong with that, except that it constantly leads to shortage of skilled labor. So any new investment that enters the country, the first question is always, are we going to find the people? And then in the short to medium term, what you see is foreign companies arriving here tend to poach people away from the neighbors, who then ultimately get those people back because the new company is not necessarily better than the previous one. So you see a fair bit of like a round table of Malaysian employees going around. So that is a important focus. The other one as a hurdle is that actually, although European companies want to use Malaysia as an export hub, but the vast majority of their export goes outside ASEAN, right? I think if you take the total trade of ASEAN combined, only 22% is within ASEAN, everything else goes to all over the world. If at the other hand, you take the EU, of the total trade of the EU, 60% is within the European Union. And that also explains why, although both in the EU and Malaysia, SMEs are 90% of the companies in terms of contribution to GDP, there's no comparisons. SMEs in Europe contribute 60% to GDP. In Malaysia, it's around 20-25%. And a big factor for that is the openness for trade of the European Union, whereby if you're a small company living, say, in Belgium, and you sell to Germany, to France, to Holland, Luxembourg, your neighboring countries, there's no borders, same currency, no import duties, so there's a lot of symmetry and synchronization. While if you're a small company in Malaysia, whether you're foreign owned or local owned, and out of Penang you want to export to Hachai or to Medan or to Manila, or you name it, the hurdles are much bigger. Yeah, officially there's no import duties, but there's a lot of non-tariff barriers that are blocking further growth of trades or making it harder. And so back to your question, from a European perspective, if only there would be more free trade across ASEAN for then European companies to come to Malaysia, manufacture here, have Malaysia as their export hub for ASEAN, that will create a massive amount of growth opportunities. So these are the prime discussions we are having. Another one is around sustainability, right? Where, look, there's many European companies operating in Malaysia who have ESG targets from their head office in Europe, for example, in terms of reliance on renewable energy for their production process. It's improving month by month in Malaysia, but there's still not enough renewable energy available for these companies, or the frameworks that the government develops are not necessarily always suitable for a broad range of European businesses. So they then face the dilemma of what do we do? Do you expand manufacturing here, but then breaching our head of requirement to rely on renewable energy, or do we expand the factory somewhere else where there's enough renewable energy available? So that is a component. The other one relates to the social part of sustainability, and as I said before, the country relies a lot on foreign labor, and it's a public secret. There's been issues with forced labor and so forth, or working conditions of foreign workers that are not necessarily always the nicest, and that has then had impact on the operations of European companies here, or European companies relying on Malaysian businesses operating in this country. Now, the good thing about it is what you see very actively, even in the absence of strong regulations in Malaysia for particularly non-listed companies in terms of sustainability, the supply chains are sorting it out. So you have large European companies buying from Malaysian businesses, whether or not these European companies have presence in Malaysia or not, but integrating these Malaysian companies in supply chain-wide initiatives, for example, to deal with labor issues and to lift the quality to a standard which is more internationally acceptable. And I do feel particularly Malaysia should take that movement serious. As I said, 70% of GDP comes from export, and the majority of that export is outside ASEAN. So somehow, but not somehow, which means everything you produce, from everything you produce in Malaysia, the majority is sold elsewhere. And so therefore you have to ask yourself the question, should we not listen to our clients? And if your clients in Europe say, well, here are our expectations for sustainability, or I stop buying from you. Now, if any country in the region would be hit by that, it would be Malaysia, because you rely more than anybody else on export. If you compare yourself with Thailand, Vietnam too, but Indonesia in particular, they rely a lot more on the local market for their economy than Malaysia does. So therefore that aspect of follow your clients, listen to your clients is a common practice, good business sense, right? So this is a bit how I'm situated in that debate, or how I see the discussion, Europe versus Malaysia. I think Malaysia can learn from the EU in terms of how did the European Union come to order this now? Can Malaysia learn from that and maybe be there the vanguard in the region to bring ASEAN to the next level, right? So that's why I think this free trade negotiation process is beneficial, particularly to Malaysia, right? Because they will now really learn in detail how the European Union works, what they expect. They will get to hear from Malaysian and European companies what their expectations are for that free trade agreement. And particularly the notion of, we have now free trade agreements between Europe and Vietnam, Europe and Singapore. Indonesia has signed in September. Thailand, Philippines and Malaysia are still negotiating. So once all these free trade agreements are in place with Europe, maybe hopefully that will then give ASEAN the signal to say, well, now that we all have a free trade agreement with Europe, let's maybe now also lift internally our inter-region trade model to bring it closer to that free trade model that Europe has itself, because look how they have been benefited themselves internally. So this is how I hope this process will work out and develop. Maybe by the end of next year we'll see how things proceed.
You said your mandate at EUROCHAM is January. Yeah. So tell me, where are you going to take your expertise next?
Well, thank you for asking. I'm staying in Malaysia. I've been 30 years in this part of the world. My own children are half Indonesian, although they work now in Europe. And realistically, my expertise, part of which is my business network, is heavily focused on operating in this region. I have a fair bit of experience, primarily with management consulting, with M&A and other types of deal advisory. And I did interim work, turnaround gigs in this region. So I'm having conversations in those areas. I got particularly in the last 2 years, and definitely also during my role with EUROCHAM, particularly focused on sustainability. So this is an area that I will further work in. But at the same time, in digitalization as well. So I've always been very interested in technology and how technology affects company strategies and operations. I'm part of a small group of men in their 50s who stopped telling dad jokes and who want to catch up on their AI skills. So I'm doing AI training every single day because I think it's very important that I understand what is the potential of the technology for companies and for society at large. And also it will definitely, in my opinion, also support our roadmap towards climate action and protecting ourselves against climate change in particular. So I will kind of position myself skill-wise on what I've done in the past, but topic or industry-wise, a kind of the crossover between sustainability and digitalization, particularly using AI solutions for sustainability purposes. So stay tuned.
Yeah. Well, companies should reach out to you for sustainability, I guess. But definitely, I would love to have you on again, especially when your third book is out, because I want to talk more about the author side of you and also then find out what have you been up to at that time. I'm sure a lot of great things would have come out at that time. And here's my final question that I ask everyone. If you had one wish to make the planet better, what would it be?
There's two components to my answer, because I see a societal and a sustainability component. On a societal level, I do regret that the world has gotten extremely polarized, and I wish we could move back a bit more to an environment where we can at least agree to disagree. I have friends across the entire political spectrum, and I enjoy sitting with them and listening to what they say and disagreeing with it, and vice versa. Nobody is yelling. We learn from each other, and I think this is how things should be. But in some countries, in a lot of countries, the public debate has gotten so polarized. Obviously, social media plays a role in that. But that's one wish I would have, is that people can veer a little bit more towards the middle. But that's how people react towards each other. But of course, part of that polarization relates to the other component, is climate change and sustainability. Unless someone comes with compelling scientific evidence that the climate is not changing, we all have to follow what science is dictating us. That is definitely in trouble. And therefore, it requires an all-planets collaboration to tackle that, because you cannot say, well, climate change only affects that country and not mine. It doesn't work like that. I was speaking 2 years ago at a sustainability summit here in Kuala Lumpur, Sustainability Brands. It's a global summit, and the keynote speaker was a gentleman by the name of Mark Buckley, who is the author of the Sustainable Development Goals, from the 17 various goals from the United Nations. And he stood there on stage, and the core of his message was to say, look, the whole sustainability discussion has gotten a bit too much in the direction of ESG reporting and compliance standards and so on. And he says, the one question I ask every government leader, every industry leader, and which I'm going to ask this audience, is a world that works for everyone, how does that look like to you? And I took over that question, and whenever I'm in the right audience, I ask that question to the public. Because if you think it through, first of all, he mentioned that a lot of industry leaders, etc., struggle with that question. And I think it's up to every person to imagine a world that works for everyone. How does that look like to you? Because that has components along the lines of the Sustainability Development Goals, or even simpler, ESG. There's an environmental component, there's a social component, and there's a government component. And I wish that every person has the opportunity to reflect on that and then carry that into the way they behave themselves in daily life, in society, the responsibilities they take on. And that could be as simple as recycling your own waste at home. It doesn't mean you have to be the CEO of a big company. But somehow we cannot say this is a planetary problem, but me as a person, I don't have to contribute to it. That doesn't fly, right? So therefore there we need to find a way to mobilize the entire global population, just as we all mobilize them to get registered on Facebook.
Wow, a world that works for everyone. Very profound. Thank you so much, Karl, and I'll have you back to discuss more.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for joining me at The Edge. Now, the stories and opinions shared by my guests are theirs alone. They are raw, personal, and do not necessarily reflect my own views or professional stance. I present these dialogues as lived realities, not absolute truth. It's for you to examine, challenge, and interpret. Like any investigation into the human condition, the evidence is laid bare. What you take away from it is entirely up to you. Once again, this podcast is supported by Work. Work is not just a co-working space, it's an ecosystem built for human connection. So whether you're an established entity or a startup, find space to grow at work. Okay, be sure to turn on the notification bell icon for this podcast. And here's a surprise. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And if you do all four, there's a mystery gift potentially waiting for you. I'm Dr. Manju Appathurai. Until the next time, stay centered, but keep your edge.